The fiddle music stopped the moment Junlien Zhao walked through the doorway of the Millbrook Town Hall, and it was not because of her. It was because of the man standing alone near the whiskey table, and the fact that every other woman in the room had spent the last hour finding reasons not to look at him. Junlien had heard the name Silas Marrow spoken in town the way people spoke of a coming storm, low and careful, as if saying it too loud might bring it faster. He had ridden into Millbrook, Wyoming territory 3 weeks earlier with a bounty paper folded in his saddlebag and a reputation that arrived a full day before he did. 6 men dead in 3 different territories, or so the story went, though nobody in town could say for certain which parts were true and which had grown in the telling the way frontier stories always did. She set down the basket of peach preserves she had carried in for the social and looked at him across the crowded room the way she looked at everything, which was directly, without apology. He was watching the room the way a man watches a room he does not trust. His hat sat low, his gun belt worn but oiled, and his eyes moved from door to window to door again, in a rhythm that told Junlien he had counted every way out of this building within 30 seconds of entering it. Nobody had asked him to dance. Nobody had asked him anything at all. Her Aunt Mabel Whitcomb, who had raised her since the ship from Canton had emptied its passengers onto a California dock 9 years before, gripped her elbow hard enough to bruise. "Do not," Mabel said, "even think it." "Think what?" Junlien said, though she already knew. "That man has killed people, Junlien. Real people, in real towns not so different from this one." "He hasn't killed anyone here." "Give him time." The fiddle player, an anxious young man named Otis Beale, who worked the mercantile counter during daylight hours, cleared his throat and struck up a new tune, uncertain, as though asking the room's permission to keep the evening moving. Couples resumed their places on the dance floor with the careful, determined cheerfulness of people trying not to look at the man standing alone by the whiskey table. Junlien crossed the room before she had fully decided to. She felt every eye in the hall land on her back like a physical weight, but that was not new to her. She had felt those eyes since she was 13 years old and the only Chinese face in a town that had built half its railroad on Chinese hands and then forgotten to thank them for it. She had learned a long time ago that being watched was simply the tax of existing somewhere you were not fully wanted, and she had decided, somewhere around her 16th year, that she would rather be watched for something she chose than for something she could not help. She stopped in front of Silas Marrow and extended her hand, palm down, the way she had seen the other women do it all evening. "You look like a man who forgot how to dance," she said, "or never learned." He looked at her hand for a long moment before he looked at her face, and something in his expression shifted, wary and searching, like a man checking a room for a trap he could not yet see. "Ma'am," he said, "I don't think that's a wise idea." "I didn't ask if it was wise." The room had gone quiet enough that Junlien could hear the creak of the floorboards under her own boots. She kept her hand extended. Silas Marrow looked past her, once, at the room full of people pretending not to watch, and something crossed his face that she would think about later and recognize, eventually, as exhaustion. Not fear. Fatigue. The particular tiredness of a man who had spent so long being feared that he had forgotten what it felt like to be simply looked at. He took her hand. His grip was careful, almost hesitant, calloused palm against her palm, and when he stepped into the dance his boots found the rhythm of the fiddle with more grace than she expected from a man built like a closed fist. "You're going to catch talk for this," he said quietly as they turned. "The kind of talk that doesn't wash off easy." "I've been catching talk since I was old enough to walk into a room," she said. I'll survive one dance. But she would not know, not yet, that the dance was only the beginning of what this town would have to say about her. The tune ended, and Silas released her hand with the same careful precision he had taken it, stepping back half a pace as though giving her room to escape if she wanted it. She did not take the room. "Junlien Zhao," she said, "in case you were wondering who'd just ruined her reputation dancing with you." Something that was almost a smile moved across his face, there and gone before it could fully arrive. "Silas Marrow," he said, "though I expect you already knew that." "Everyone knows that." "Everyone knows a story," he said. "That's different from knowing a name." Before she could answer, the hall's double doors banged open, hard enough to rattle the glass in the windows, and a man Junlien recognized as Otis Reddick, who ran the freight office and fancied himself the closest thing Millbrook had to unofficial law in the absence of a proper marshal, strode in with 3 other men behind him, all of them wearing the particular righteousness of men who believed they had arrived just in time to prevent a disaster. "Marrow!" Reddick's voice cut through the fiddle music, which stumbled and died again. "You were told to stay clear of town functions." "Told by who?" Silas said, and his voice had changed, flattened into something with no give in it at all. "Told by common sense, if you had any." Reddick's eyes cut sideways to Junlien, and something ugly moved behind them. "And I see you've already found trouble to drag into it with you." Junlien felt her spine go rigid. "I chose to dance with him. Nobody dragged me anywhere." "Miss Zhao, I don't believe anyone was addressing you." "Then you should have been," she said, "since I'm the one you're talking about." A ripple of tension moved through the room, the particular electric stillness of a crowd bracing for something. Silas had not moved, but Junlien noticed his weight had shifted, subtle, balanced, the stance of a man who had learned to be ready for violence without ever looking like he was expecting it. Reddick's hand drifted toward the pistol at his hip, more habit than intention, and that was the moment the surface conflict tipped into something with real danger in it. "You want to draw on an unarmed man at a church social, Reddick," Silas said. "You go right ahead, but you'll answer for it same as anyone." "You're not unarmed." "I haven't touched my gun since I walked in this building. Ask anyone who's been watching me. I know they have been." The silence that followed had weight to it. Somewhere near the back of the hall, a woman's voice, small but clear, said, "He's telling the truth. He's had both hands in plain sight the whole evening." It was Widow Talmadge, who ran the boarding house and had, Junlien suspected, been watching Silas as closely as everyone else, though for entirely different reasons. Reddick's jaw worked. His hand dropped from his hip, slow, reluctant, like a man backing away from a fight he had already decided he could not win in front of witnesses. "This isn't finished," he said, to Silas, though his eyes had already moved to Junlien in a way that made her stomach turn cold. He left, his 3 companions trailing after him, and the hall exhaled as one body, the fiddle picking back up uncertain and thin, couples returning to the floor with the studied casualness of people who wanted very badly to pretend nothing had happened. Junlien looked at Silas. "He'll come after you again." "Probably. That doesn't worry you?" "Worrying about it won't change when it happens," he said. "Only how ready I am." But what Junlien did not know, standing there in the aftermath of the confrontation with her pulse still climbing, was that Reddick's threat had very little to do with Silas Marrow at all, and everything to do with a debt her late father had left behind that she had not yet discovered existed. The walk home that night took longer than it should have, because Mabel kept stopping in the middle of the road to say things she had already said twice, each time with a little less conviction behind it. Junlien let her aunt talk herself out. She had learned that Mabel's fear worked itself loose the same way a splinter did, slowly and with more fuss than the wound ever warranted. "You don't know a thing about that man," Mabel said, for the third time. "I know he stood still while another man reached for his gun," Julienne said. "That tells me something." "It tells you he's dangerous." "It tells me he's careful. There's a difference, Aunt Mabel, and I think you know it same as I do." Mabel did not answer that, which was as close to agreement as she ever came. The days that followed carried a strange new weight through Millbrook, the kind of weight a town takes on when it has witnessed something it cannot quite categorize. Julienne felt it every time she walked to the mercantile for flour or thread, the way conversations quieted a half-beat too late, the way certain women crossed the street rather than pass close enough to speak. The butcher's wife, a woman named Prudence Kellerman who had never once in 9 years said an unkind word to Julienne, suddenly found reasons to busy herself in the back room whenever Julienne came through the door. She did not care, or she told herself she did not, which amounted to the same thing most days. What surprised her more than the town's coldness was its curiosity. Twice that week, women she barely knew found excuses to ask after her, feigning concern about a debt she had not yet learned existed. Questions dressed up as kindness that felt, underneath, like something closer to appetite. She answered none of them honestly. Whatever was coming, she intended to meet it standing, not gossiped about into a shape she would not recognize. It was on the 4th morning after the dance that Silas appeared at the edge of her aunt's property, standing near the split-rail fence with his hat in his hands, an image so far removed from the gunslinger Millbrook whispered about that Julienne nearly did not recognize him from the kitchen window. "Mrs. Whitcomb's going to run me off with a broom," he said, when Julienne came out onto the porch. "Probably," Julienne said. "What are you doing here, Mr. Merrow?" "Came to say I'm sorry. For the trouble at the hall." He turned his hat over once in his hands, a habit she would come to recognize as the closest thing he had to nervousness. "Wasn't my intention to make things harder on you." "You didn't make anything harder. Reddick did that all on his own." "He'll keep at it." "I know." Silas studied her for a long moment, the same searching look he had given her before he took her hand at the dance, as though trying to work out what kind of person stood in front of him, and finding the answer did not fit any category he had used before. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Why'd you do it? Ask me to dance. Everyone else in that hall was doing everything they could not to look at me, and you walked straight across the room." Julienne considered the question honestly before she answered it. "Because I know what it feels like to walk into a room and have everyone decide who you are before you've said a single word," she said. "I've had that happen to me my whole life here. It seemed wrong to do the same thing to someone else, whatever the rest of them said about you." Something moved through his face, quick and unguarded, gone before he could stop it. "That's a kinder reason than I deserve." "I didn't ask if you deserved it." He laughed, short and surprised, as though the sound had escaped before he gave it permission. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, and she found she wanted to hear it again. "You want some coffee?" she asked. "Or are you planning to stand at that fence all morning working up the nerve to leave?" "I hadn't thought that far ahead." "Then come sit. Mabel won't shoot you before noon. She likes her mornings peaceful." He came, and they sat on the porch steps with 2 tin cups between them, and for the better part of an hour talked about nothing that mattered, the price of feed, the state of the road out past the creek crossing, the particular stubbornness of Mabel's rooster, and Julienne found that Silas Merrow, stripped of the reputation that walked into every room a half step ahead of him, was simply a quiet man who listened more than he spoke and noticed more than he let on. It was the first easy hour either of them had spent with another person, and longer than either would admit. But the moment did not last, because that was when Otis Reddick's freight wagon came rattling up the road toward the Whitcomb property at a pace that meant trouble, and Junlien felt whatever ease had settled between them vanish in an instant. Reddick reined in hard at the fence line, and this time he was not alone. A man Junlien did not recognize sat beside him on the wagon bench, thin and sharp-featured, wearing a coat too fine for frontier travel, and carrying himself with the particular stillness of a man used to being obeyed. "Miss Jow," Reddick said, not bothering to dismount. "This is Mr. Lucius Grant. He's come from the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne. Seems your late father left some business unfinished before he passed." Junlien's stomach dropped. "My father's been dead 3 years. What business could possibly still be open?" Lucius Grant's smile was thin and practiced, the smile of a man who had delivered bad news so many times it no longer touched him. "A debt, Miss Jow, $400, taken against the deed to this property in 1871, never repaid. The note has come due, and the holder has requested collection." "That's impossible. My father never borrowed against this land." "I have the paper right here," Grant said, and produced a folded document from inside his coat, with the smooth, practiced motion of a man who had rehearsed the gesture many times before. "Signed and witnessed. You have 30 days to satisfy the debt, or the land reverts to the note holder." Junlien felt Silas go very still beside her, and when she glanced at him, she saw something sharpen in his expression, some old instinct waking up behind his eyes. "Who holds the note?" Silas asked, before Junlien could find her own voice. Grant's gaze flicked to him, assessing, unbothered. "That information isn't relevant to Miss Zhao's obligation." "It's relevant to me," Silas said, and something in his tone made even Reddick shift uneasily on the wagon bench. Grant did not answer. He simply inclined his head, folded the paper back into his coat, and gave the reins a light shake that sent the wagon rolling back toward town, Reddick following without another word. Junlien stood at the fence line with her heart pounding, the ground she had thought solid beneath her for 19 years suddenly uncertain. "This can't be real," she said. "My father was careful with money. He would never have signed something like that." "Maybe he didn't," Silas said quietly. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean I've seen paper like that before. Forged signatures, backdated notes, land grabbed out from under folks who never borrowed a dime in their lives." His jaw was tight, his eyes distant, focused on something in his memory that clearly cost him to look at. "I've seen it end worse than a 30-day notice." That was the moment Junlien understood there was more to Silas Morrow's past than a reputation earned in gunfights, and that whatever had brought him to Millbrook carried more weight than a bounty paper. They sat together on the porch steps that evening, after Mabel had gone to bed, still muttering about proper behavior and appearances, and for the first time since he had ridden into Millbrook, Silas Morrow told Junlien the truth about who he was. "I wasn't always a man people crossed the street to avoid," he said, turning his hat over in his hands the way he did when the words came hard. "I had a claim once, out in the Dakota Territory. Good land. My own hands built the cabin on it. I had a wife." Junlien went still, listening. "Her name was Eleanor. We'd been married 2 years when a man came through with paper claiming my father-in-law owed a debt against the property, a debt neither of us had ever heard of." His voice had gone flat, controlled, the voice of a man reciting something he had told himself 1,000 times in the dark. "We fought it in the territorial court and lost, because the man holding the note had more money for lawyers than we ever would. They put us off the land in the dead of winter. Eleanor took sick on the road looking for shelter, and there wasn't a doctor for 60 miles that would come in the storm that hit that week." Silas. I buried her myself, he said. Ground was so hard I broke 2 shovels doing it. He looked out at the dark line of the horizon, and Julianne saw, for the first time, the exact shape of what had made him the man the whole territory feared. After that, I stopped believing the law would protect anybody who couldn't pay for it. I started making sure it protected people who couldn't otherwise afford protecting. That's why men hunt you. Some of the men I've faced deserved exactly what they got, he said. I won't apologize for that, not to you, not to anybody. But it cost me every soft thing I used to be, and I've spent 5 years telling myself that was a fair trade. He turned to look at her fully then, something raw and unguarded moving across his face in the lamplight. Until a woman walked across a dance floor and made me remember what it felt like to be looked at like a person instead of a story. Julianne's throat tightened. I'm not looking for someone to fix, Silas. I don't need saving. I know that, he said. I've never once thought you needed saving. It's the furthest thing from what I think when I look at you. Then what do you think? He was quiet for a long moment, close enough now that she could feel the warmth off him in the cool evening air. I think you're the first person in 5 years who's made this territory feel like somewhere a man could stay instead of somewhere he passes through. She did not move away when he reached up and brushed a strand of hair back from her face, his calloused thumb grazing her cheekbone with a gentleness that seemed impossible from hands that had done what his had done. Neither of them spoke. The quiet between them held everything neither of them was ready to say outright, and when he finally lowered his hand, it was with visible reluctance. We'll figure out this debt, he said instead, voice rough. I promise you that. You don't owe me any promises. I'm making one anyway. The next morning, Silas rode into town before dawn and did not return until well past noon, and when he found Julianne at the well behind the Whitcomb house, his face carried news that made her set down the water bucket before she had finished filling it. The note holder is a man named Otis Reddick, he said, or he's frontin' for one. I spent half the morning at the land office in Cheyenne with a man I trust, and the signature on your father's supposed debt doesn't match a single other document your father ever filed. Reddick's been buying up notes on land all through this valley for 2 years, forging debts against families who can't afford to fight him in court. Yours isn't the first. It won't be the last unless somebody stops him. Julianne felt something cold settle into her chest. Why would he target my father specifically? Best guess, because your father owned the water rights on this stretch of the creek, and Reddick's been trying to consolidate every water claim between here and the rail spur for 2 years. Man who controls the water controls who gets to stay in this valley and who has to sell out. Silas's jaw was tight. Your family was in his way. So he waited until my father died and came after me instead, thinking I'd have no way to fight it? That's about the size of it. Julianne felt fear move through her, but underneath it, something harder and more useful was rising to take its place. Then we prove the forgery. It won't be simple. Reddick's got money behind him, and a friend in Lucius Grant who'll swear that paper is real in front of any judge Reddick can buy. I don't care if it's simple, Julianne said. I've spent my whole life in this territory being told what I couldn't do because of where I was born and what I looked like. I am not losing my father's land to a forged signature because a man decided I'd be too frightened to fight back. Something like pride moved across Silas's face, quiet and unmistakable. "Then we fight it," he said. "Together, if you'll have me standing beside you." "I will," she said, and meant it in more ways than the sentence contained. But that night, the danger Reddick represented stopped being a matter of paper and law, and became something far more immediate when Junlien woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of her aunt screaming from the front room. The hay barn was burning by the time Junlien reached the yard, flames climbing fast against the black summer sky, and she could hear the terrified screams of the 2 horses still trapped inside. She did not think. She grabbed the wet feed sack from beside the trough and ran straight for the barn doors, ignoring Mabel's frantic shouting behind her. The heat hit her like a wall the moment she pulled the door open, smoke thick enough to blind her within seconds, but she pressed the wet sack over her mouth and pushed forward toward the sound of the horses' panicked stamping. She found the first stall by memory alone, fingers fumbling with the latch through smoke that stung tears from her eyes, and she got the gelding loose and driven toward the door just as a support beam overhead groaned with a sound that meant it would not hold much longer. She was reaching for the second stall when a hand closed hard around her arm and pulled her backward with a strength that left no room for argument. "Second horse!" she gasped, fighting against the grip. "I've got her. Get out." Silas shoved her toward the door, and through the smoke she saw him move toward the remaining stall with the same economical certainty he carried into every dangerous moment. No wasted motion, no panic, just calculation and speed. He had the mare loose and running for the door seconds before the beam gave way entirely, and Junlien stumbled out into the yard, with her lungs burning and her aunt's arms closing around her a heartbeat later. Silas emerged just behind the mare, coughing. Soot streaked across his face, and the barn collapsed in on itself behind him in a roar of sparks and flame that lit the whole yard orange. "You could have died in there," Junlien said, once she could speak again, her voice shaking with something that was not entirely fear. "So could you," he said. "Don't you ever run into a burning building like that again. The horses would have burned alive. And you nearly did with 'em." His hands were on her shoulders now, gripping hard enough that she understood exactly how frightened he had been. "I've buried one woman I loved, Junlien. I am not doing it twice." The words hung in the smoke-filled air between them, unmistakable, unretractable, and Junlien felt something in her chest crack open at the sound of them. "You love me," she said quietly. "I think I have since you crossed that dance floor," he said. "I told myself it was foolishness. A man like me has no business wanting something soft in a life built on hard things. But I'm done pretending otherwise." His hand came up to cradle her soot-streaked face, and this time neither of them hesitated. "I love you, Junlien Zhao. However this ends with Reddick, I needed you to know that before we go any further." She kissed him then, smoke and ash and all, and he kissed her back like a man who had spent 5 years believing he had lost the right to want anything at all. The fire had been no accident. Of that everyone in the yard was certain, but proving Otis Reddick's hand in it would require more than certainty, and the confrontation that followed 3 days later in the office of Judge Elam Voss at the Territorial Courthouse in Cheyenne was the highest stakes moment either of them had yet faced. Silas had spent those 3 days riding hard between Millbrook and Cheyenne, gathering testimony from 2 other families Reddick had targeted with similar forged notes, families too frightened to speak up until a woman named Widow Talmadge, moved by what she had witnessed at the dance and the fire both, agreed to testify that she had seen Lucius Grant meeting privately with Reddick on more than one occasion before the debt paper ever appeared. One of the families, the Osbornes, had lost 40 acres of grazing land to a note nearly identical in wording to the one now threatening Julienne, and their willingness to speak, once Widow Talmadge broke the silence first, gave Silas the pattern he needed to take before a judge. Reddick sat across the judge's office with Grant beside him, composed, confident, a man who had bought his way out of trouble before and expected to again. But when Julienne laid her father's actual business ledgers on the judge's desk, 3 years of meticulous handwriting that bore no resemblance to the signature on the forged note, and when Widow Talmadge gave her account in a voice that did not waver despite Reddick's furious glare, something in the room's balance began to shift. "This is character assassination," Reddick said, "against a respected businessman, based on the word of a woman who danced with a known killer at a public function." "The word of a known killer got 2 horses out of a burning barn that your fire nearly cost 2 women their lives in," Silas said, standing beside Julienne with a stillness that carried more weight than any raised voice could have. "I'd be careful what you call respectable in a room with a judge, Reddick." Judge Voss studied the ledgers for a long, silent moment, then looked up at Reddick over the rim of his spectacles. "Mr. Reddick, I've had 3 separate families through this office in the past year with remarkably similar stories about notes against land you happen to be interested in acquiring. I believe I'll be ordering a full audit of every note you hold in this territory, starting with Miss Jow's." Reddick's composure finally cracked, color rising in his face, and for a moment Julienne thought he might do something reckless in the judge's own office. But Silas took one step forward, unhurried, and the look on his face was enough to make Reddick sit back down without another word. The note against the Jow property was voided within the week. The audit into Reddick's other claims begun soon after, and by the time the territorial marshal arrived to serve him with formal charges of fraud, Otis Reddick had already fled the county, leaving behind a debt of his own that would take the law considerably longer than 30 days to collect. Lucius Grant, less loyal than his fine coat suggested, gave a full statement to the marshal within a day of Reddick's disappearance, naming every family whose land had been taken through the same forged paper, and the audit that followed returned 3 separate parcels to their rightful owners before the season turned. 3 months later, the hay barn stood rebuilt on the Whitcomb property, fresh lumber pale against the older, weathered boards of the house beside it, and the 2 horses Silas had pulled from the fire grazed contentedly in a new pasture fenced with his own hands. Julienne stood at the fence line one warm evening in early autumn, watching Silas work a young colt on a lead line with the same patient, deliberate care he brought to everything he touched now, and thought about how far the both of them had traveled since the night of the dance. Silas Marrow no longer wore his gun into town. He had taken work at the Whitcomb property, helping manage the water rights his testimony had helped secure, and though some in Millbrook still spoke his name with old caution, more had come to see, over the slow accumulation of ordinary days, that the man who had once been only a reputation was, in fact, simply a man who had been given a reason to set that reputation down. Even Prudence Kellerman, who had once avoided the back room rather than serve Julienne, now waved from her porch whenever the 2 of them passed, and Julienne had learned that a town's memory, however stubborn, could be worn smooth by enough ordinary mornings stacked one on top of another. Mabel Whitcomb, who had once threatened him with a broom, now set an extra plate for him at supper without being asked. "You're staring," Silas said, without turning around, and Julienne laughed. "I'm allowed to stare at my own husband," she said, and the word still felt new enough in her mouth to carry a small thrill every time she used it. 3 weeks married in the small ceremony the whole valley had turned out for. The same fiddle player who had once stumbled through a nervous tune at the town hall, now playing steady and sure at their wedding instead. Silas crossed the yard to where she stood, resting his forearms on the top rail of the fence beside her, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, content in the particular quiet that had become theirs alone. "Never thought I'd get a second chance at this," he said finally. "Not after Eleanor. Not after everything I let myself become." "You didn't get a second chance," Gunslingers said. "You made one. There's a difference." He looked at her for a long moment, something warm and unguarded in his face that the whole territory would have sworn, 3 months earlier, the gunslinger Silas Marrow was no longer capable of. Then he smiled and reached for her hand the same careful way he had that first night at the dance, and neither of them let go. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.